After years of secrecy, delay, and public pressure, the Epstein files have finally begun to surface. Not all of them, not even close, but enough to expose the contours of a world that remained sealed inside the Department of Justice for decades. Thousands of documents, roughly 4,000 in this first release, were unsealed, offering a partial but disturbing glimpse into Jeffrey Epstein's universe. These records were taken from Epstein's estate, seized over the years, reviewed behind closed doors, and only now made public. Our team has gone through them, line by line, image by image, document by document. This investigation will be broken into several strands: the celebrities, the victims, and the redactions, and what each of those categories tells us about how power operates when crimes intersect with influence. Let's begin with what the public notices first. Jeffrey Epstein did not live in isolation. The files confirm what was already suspected. He socialized broadly and deliberately. His network extended across entertainment, politics, finance, royalty, and elite social circles. Photographs show him in the company of globally recognizable figures, musicians, actors, politicians, and members of high society. Images show Epstein with Michael Jackson. Others place him alongside Diana Ross. Former U.S. President Bill Clinton appears repeatedly in the photo archive, sometimes accompanied by actor Kevin Spacey. There's also a photograph of Mick Jagger with Ghislaine Maxwell. None of these images include context. There are no captions explaining when they were taken, who took them, or under what circumstances. That absence is important. These photos were not curated for publication. They were part of Epstein's private collection, seized and stored, now released without narrative framing. And this distinction matters. Association does not equal guilt. Epstein cultivated relationships strategically. Proximity to him does not automatically imply wrongdoing. Some individuals have openly expressed regret for ever knowing him. Others deny any knowledge of his crimes, but documentation of proximity still matters because influence creates silence, hesitation, and protection, even when no crime is directly alleged. Among the most scrutinized images are those involving Prince Andrew. The files include photographs of Andrew in social settings with Epstein and Maxwell. One image depicts him reclining across multiple women. Ghislaine Maxwell is the only other person identified by name in that document. Through cross-referencing with previously known photographs, journalists have determined that at least one of these images was taken at Sandringham, a royal residence in the United Kingdom. The setting alone raises questions about access and normalization. Prince Andrew has long acknowledged his friendship with Epstein and Maxwell. He later reached a financial settlement with Virginia Giuffre, who accused him of sexual assault, allegations he has consistently denied. The settlement contained no admission of guilt. The files do not introduce new criminal allegations against him, but they reinforce how embedded Epstein was within elite spaces that were presumed to be beyond scrutiny. And this pattern, visibility without accountability, repeats throughout the release. This first disclosure is not a full unveiling. It is a controlled opening. Thousands of pages were released, but thousands more remain sealed. Even within the released material, black bars dominate the pages. Faces are hidden, names erased, entire documents are unreadable. And yet, despite those limitations, a picture begins to emerge, a network built not just on exploitation, but on access, a system where status diluted suspicion, and an archive that raises as many questions as it answers. In the next part, we move away from celebrities and toward what matters most to the victims and how their experiences are encoded inside these files, often hidden behind redactions that speak louder than words. If the celebrity photographs show the surface of Epstein's world, the victim records expose its core. Behind the images of wealth and access are documents that trace how young women, and in many cases minors, were identified, recruited, transported, and controlled. The Department of Justice states that in this release alone, more than 2,200 names and images of victims and their relatives were redacted. That number is not speculative. It is an admission by the government. What remains visible, however, is enough to understand how the system functioned. Several photographs in the files show young females in private settings, hotel rooms, apartments, and foreign cities. One image shows two young females in Paris. Their faces are entirely obscured. The DOJ has not clarified whether they were minors at the time the photo was taken, only that their identities were redacted to protect victims. This matters because survivor testimony from previous cases has already established that Epstein routinely transported recruited girls internationally, including to France. Paris was not incidental, it was part of the circuit. Victims have testified that they were often approached with promises of work as massage therapists or assistants, legitimate sounding opportunities that mask the reality of exploitation. Several documents in this release quietly reinforce that pattern. Among the most chilling records are message pads spanning 2004 and 2005, entered into evidence in a case involving a victim identified as Jane Doe 3. These notes were used to relay messages to Epstein. Two entries stand out. "I have a female for him." The names of the caller and the note taker are redacted. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who delivered the message. But the phrasing is explicit enough to remove ambiguity. This was not casual social coordination. It reflects a transactional system. These message pads matter because they document process, not rumor. They show how recruitment was operationalized through intermediaries, assistants, and handlers, many of whom remain unidentified in the public record. Another document resembles a scrapbook or storybook, visually similar to the controversial birthday album released earlier in related litigation. This version is heavily redacted, but fragments of text remain visible at the top of one page. "Once upon a time, there was a clueless little girl," and the language is disturbing not because of what it says outright, but because of what it suggests: normalization, ownership, and narrative framing of abuse. These were not private thoughts. These were preserved materials, kept, stored, and now partially revealed. Then there are law enforcement records. One Palm Beach Police Department incident report lists 358 El Brillo Way, Epstein's residence, as the common location for multiple incidents. Epstein is named as one of 3 individuals arrested in connection with the report. The names of the other 2 are completely redacted with no explanation provided. Across dozens of pages, victim testimony is summarized. Many individuals are explicitly labeled as juveniles. The consistency of location, method, and language reinforces what survivors have said for years. This was not isolated misconduct. It was a repeated pattern centered around specific properties. Some redactions are necessary. Victim protection is essential, but not all redactions are explained. Images of women are blacked out without clarity on whether the individuals were minors, adults, witnesses, or unrelated third parties. Names of alleged facilitators are removed while Epstein's name remains visible, and in many cases there is no written justification attached, despite the transparency law requiring it. This lack of clarity fuels distrust. Not because of conspiracy, but because process without explanation erodes credibility. And that leads us to the most controversial aspect of this release: documents that are not merely redacted, but completely erased. In Part 3, we examine the blacked-out grand jury testimony, inconsistent redaction decisions, and why the Department of Justice itself has acknowledged it may have failed to properly redact sensitive material, an admission that raises serious questions about competence, intent, and accountability. If Part 2 showed how the files document a recruitment system, Part 3 reveals something equally explosive. The release itself is messy, inconsistent, and in some places almost unreadable, and that has become the story because the public isn't just reacting to what the DOJ revealed, they're reacting to what it refused to reveal and how. The most striking example is grand jury testimony. 119 pages released as a single document with every line completely blacked out. Not partial redactions, not selective removals, entire pages erased from top to bottom. Grand jury material is often protected under strict rules, yes. But here's the issue. The DOJ didn't release a legal explanation in the file itself that clearly tells the public what standard was applied and why the entire thing is unreadable. When an agency drops a fully blacked out document into a transparency release, it sends a message, intended or not, that it is complying in form, not in substance. And every time the public sees an all-black document, the same reaction follows: cover-up. Even if there is a legal rationale, the absence of clear, consistent explanations creates maximum distrust. trust. The second problem is inconsistency. In several instances, a person is redacted in one official document, but in other publicly available sources, the same person appears unredacted in the same scene. That contradiction doesn't just look sloppy, it makes the DOJ appear either careless or selective. One widely discussed example involves a redacted figure who is identifiable via publicly available footage and reporting as academic Steven Pinker. Pinker has stated he once traveled on Epstein's plane and had no relationship with him. The core point here is not his claim, it's what the inconsistency reveals. If the DOJ redacts someone's identity in an official transparency release, but the same identity can be easily confirmed elsewhere, then the redaction becomes performative rather than protective. That creates two outcomes. One, victims may not be adequately protected if the system is inconsistent. Two, third parties may appear suspicious simply because they were redacted. Both outcomes are disastrous. The DOJ disclaimer, "We might have missed things." Then there's something even more unusual. At the top of the DOJ's release portal, there is reportedly a disclaimer stating that the department might have inadvertently failed to redact information. In some places, that is not a confidence-building statement. It suggests the review process was rushed, overloaded, or poorly managed. And remember, the DOJ has said it used a large team to review the release for victim protection. If, after all that, they still warn the public they may have missed sensitive identifiers, then the question becomes, was this release driven by thoroughness or by deadline pressure and political optics? Because the government is now in the worst possible position, accused of over-redacting to hide accountability while also admitting it may have under-redacted and exposed protected information. The transparency paradox. This is the paradox of the Epstein files release. The government claims it's protecting victims, but it is also withholding context that the public needs to understand what it is seeing. The public sees photos without timestamps, documents without clear origins, names blacked out without justification, and grand jury testimony that has been converted into a blank rectangle. That is not transparency, that is controlled exposure, and it matters because the Epstein story is not just about what Epstein did, it's also about what institutions did and did not do when presented with evidence. Which leads us to a crucial question raised by this release. If the DOJ had enough material to produce thousands of documents today, what did it have years ago, and what does it still have now? The No New Trump mentions claim and why it matters. Some coverage of this first batch notes there is no new mention of President Trump in the newly released documents. That fact is repeatedly emphasized in media commentary, partly because Trump's past proximity to Epstein is well documented publicly. Trump has claimed he distanced himself from Epstein in the early 2000s. But from an investigative standpoint, the more important issue is not whether a name appears in a specific release. The issue is what was selected, what was delayed, and what remains sealed. If thousands more documents are coming in the weeks ahead, then conclusions based on absence in the first batch are premature. The first batch is not the end, it's a controlled start. In Part 4, we'll cover what happens next, the promised future releases, what Congress and victims' attorneys are likely to do, and why the next wave of documents could shift the story from scandal to institutional accountability. This first release of the Epstein files was never going to bring closure. It was designed, intentionally or not, to reopen questions that have been buried for years. The Department of Justice has already stated that thousands more documents will be released in the weeks ahead. That promise alone reshapes the narrative. It confirms that what the public has seen so far is not the full record, not even close. And it raises the most important question of all. If these materials existed all along, why were they kept sealed for so long? Victims' attorneys have made it clear this release is insufficient. Several legal teams representing survivors are now preparing actions that could force deeper disclosure, not through voluntary transparency, but through court-ordered discovery. Civil litigation against federal agencies is being openly discussed, particularly around failures to act on early warnings and complaints. And those early warnings matter because if investigators or prosecutors had credible information years before Epstein's crimes became public, and the file suggests they did, then this moves beyond moral failure into legal exposure. Congress is also watching closely. Lawmakers who pushed for the transparency release are already questioning whether the DOJ has fully complied with the law's intent. Oversight hearings, subpoenas, and even contempt proceedings are being discussed publicly. The issue is no longer Epstein alone. It is whether the justice system itself obstructed accountability. What these files ultimately expose is not just an individual predator, but a system that failed repeatedly, a system where red tape delayed action, where influence softened scrutiny, where complaints were minimized, where documents sat in vaults while abuse continued elsewhere. Even now, the way this release was handled reinforces that pattern. Heavy redactions without explanation, entire sections erased, inconsistent standards, and disclaimers that admit error rather than demonstrate confidence. Transparency, when done properly, builds trust. Transparency, when done selectively, erodes it. The first batch of documents did what it needed to do. It confirmed scale. It confirmed that there were hundreds, likely over 1,000 victims. It confirmed that recruitment was structured. It confirmed that Epstein's access to elite circles was real. And it confirmed that law enforcement had more information than previously acknowledged. The next releases will determine whether accountability follows. Will we see internal DOJ communications about charging decisions, records showing who declined to act and why, clearer timelines connecting complaints to inaction, explanations for redactions that currently make no sense? Or will the public receive another wave of documents stripped of context and meaning? The Epstein files are no longer sealed, but the truth they contain is still fragmented. Every black bar, every missing page, every unexplained delay becomes part of the story, not because of conspiracy, but because absence is evidence when accountability is at stake. This case is no longer about one man. It is about whether institutions designed to protect the public can be forced to confront their own failures. The release of these files is not the end of the Epstein story. It is the beginning of the accountability phase. And what comes next will determine whether this moment becomes a historical footnote and/or a turning point. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and don't stop asking who decided what you're allowed to see.